sort of some of the considerations to do before you start into the ALM journey for the Power Platform and Dataverse. And then, what does that include in terms of best practices from a branching strategy, as well as from an Azure DevOps pipelines perspective. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about the governance. I'll touch a little bit on the COE starter kit, although I know there was another session run by Manuela earlier, sort of a couple of days ago, and she's in a way better position to present that topic than I am. But I'll just quickly sort of skim through it. But I'll focus more on the technical side, which is the AA for AM. So if you haven't heard that term, just stick till the end and then you'll hear about it. So a little bit about myself. I'm Rami. I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand. I'm a solution architect currently working for a company called DXC Technology. We are focused on sort of Dynamics 365, Dataverse, Power Platform sort of types of deliverable. But I'm also a little bit of a generalist. So my capabilities go a little bit beyond Dynamics 365, Dataverse, and the Power Platform, and a little bit more on the Azure side as well. And Wellington, being the political capital of New Zealand, is the place where most of our customers are in the public sector, so government departments. And it's very seldom to actually have an implementation that is a standalone without having, some Azure components or some integration with legacy systems. And as such, whatever systems that we're building are usually quite large, be it, purely Dataverse or more on the Dynamics 365 sort of first-party apps. And that's why following best practices is a must-have. And also being in the public sector, you get under a lot of sort of auditing and revisions. So you have to make sure that everything is following sort of the latest and the greatest and is best practice. So I mentioned, I've been in New Zealand for around 15 years so far, going strong. And, I love New Zealand. Hopefully when the borders open, you guys can come in, and I'm sort of missing the in-person events, but yeah, hopefully that will happen again. So some of the activities that I do, part of the community, I run the Wellington Power Platform user group. We usually sort of have events on a monthly basis, but I also do larger conferences, such as the New Zealand Business Application Summit, which we had a couple of weeks ago, as well as sort of smaller events like the Global Power Platform Bootcamp, which is coming up in February. And when I have a little bit of spare time, I write books. So I know, Danish, you've got your book out. So I thought I'll share my book details as well. Mine is probably getting a little bit old in age. It was released, if I'm not mistaken, in 2016. And it's sort of starting to get a little bit of sort of old age. So it's time for a second edition to go out. And part of the work that I've done in the community sort of helped me receive my MVP. So I've been an MVP since 2015. Another qualification that I've got is the TOGAF qualification. So this is the Open Group Architecture Framework qualification. And usually people don't brag too much about it, but I thought I might put it into context so that people understand sort of some of the disciplines that I've learned from the architecture or the enterprise architecture capabilities that we can apply on a day-to-day basis, and also in terms of maturity of your organization using Dataverse and the Power Platform. So typically in TOGAF, they talk about something that is a maturity model. So this is what a maturity model would look like. They would have sort of different stages of that maturity, based on whatever discipline you're working on. In this example that I've got on the slide, this is around business transformation readiness assessment. And, you can have not defined, so you have zero readiness, you're not mature in that stage. Ad hoc means that, people can do it independently, but there's no sort of common understanding across the organization and so on. Repeatable means that, we've got a rhythm, we know how it works, we've got sort of templates to use it and so on. And then it moves into the different stages all the way up until you get to optimized. Optimized mean that, this discipline leads the rest of the organization. This is the center of attention, and this is how you move forward. Now, optimized is sometimes a little bit sort of over the top, if you want, and it could be too expensive to get into that specific state. So that's why the target, so the industry target, is usually to go towards managed. So I love that concept, and I thought, all right, well, let me try and add that same sort of understanding of the maturity model into ALM or into DevOps. So I came up with a sort of a few options in there. The first one is defining the level, so not defined ad hoc, defined optimized. And sort of those will show sort of the different levels that an organization can sort of go through in terms of maturity. But also on the left-hand side, I talked about the different disciplines. Now, this is more around DevOps in general, and it covers quite a few aspects of DevOps. But today, given that it's a more an ALM talk, I'm going to be focusing specifically on a couple of disciplines in there. I would love to spend more time talking about the rest of the disciplines, but unfortunately, this is something that takes a long time, and I can easily spend a whole day talking about it. So the first one that I'll highlight is deployments. So how do we do deployments? And back in the days, especially with smaller implementations, and when the tools were not readily available, a lot of our deployments were done manually. And with time, people started scripting them as those libraries became available. And now we're looking at using things like Azure DevOps pipelines, where everything is sort of natively integrated with the platform, and we can automate everything within a click of a button or within the happening of an event. The next one that I want to talk about is environment control. And that's an important one because, when it comes to setting up your environment, be it, from a development environment or one of the upstream environments, there's a lot of conversations about, do I actually create them once and keep them in there and keep using them? Or do I need to be a little bit more sort of proactive and then use that on sort of an automated way so that, I create an environment on demand whenever I'm working on something specific. And again, that takes you through the different maturity models and sort of how ready you are to actually take some of the more automated bits and then sort of achieve a specific target. Now, keep in mind that it all depends, just like any architecture question, which one should I do? It all depends. If you have a smaller project, I think going up the maturity model and doing something that is a bit more advanced is maybe an overkill and is not going to give you a lot of benefit for what you're doing. However, if there's you're in a large organization, large project, sort of multiple teams doing development, then going up that sort of maturity ladder is probably a good idea because you're going to save you a lot of headaches further down the track. But in general, what we would say is the target is to be in the defined stage, and then to have something that is sort of well-defined across your organization, good understanding of how it works, and use it across. Maybe optimized, is sort of the next step, but that could be too expensive, as I said. And, only when you're in a situation where all this sort of ALM work drives the rest of the project that you would go in there. But I've seen it sort of go either way. And how does that fit within sort of the Power Platform maturity? Well, it's really interesting to see that sort of recently they've announced the Power Platform adoption maturity model. And in there, they talk about those different levels, so level 100 to 500. And again, it covers the same sort of terms or the same vocabulary, if you want, than sort of the original one that I mentioned. And that's sort of initial, so there's just basic understanding of how things work, repeatable, as in, a step beyond ad hoc, defined, which is the one that I talked about, capable, which means that the team is well-oiled and they use it all the time, and efficient or optimized means that, it's driving the rest of the development and so on. And there's a link in there in the Microsoft Docs that explains sort of what are those levels and what does each one of them sort of cover. This is specifically around sort of the adoption of the Power Platform. And again, it goes hand in hand with sort of the work that you're trying to do and the ALM development that you're trying to do, or the governance per se. Cool. Now, in a sort of life cycle of a project, what are the different steps to follow? So, there's a few things that you have to do when you're building a new sort of Dataverse implementation. And you would start by doing some planning and tracking and understanding sort of what needs to be done and how you need to start. You do the development, you do the dev, you do the testing, and then you finally do the deployment. And finally, it goes into operational mode. You monitor, you sort of get some feedback, and then as things sort of progress, you feed back into that planning, and then you carry on with your application lifecycle. So this is sort of the sort of end-to-end, start to finish of sort of the different cycles, especially if you're doing an agile project. Then you would have that iterative sort of sprinting capability, or maybe program increments, where you go through all of that, feedback into the backlog, and then sort of address sort of some of your requirements. So the first part of the presentation, as I mentioned, is going to be ALM focused. The second part of the presentation is going to be focused more on the governance side of things. So basically what I'm going to say is that I've got two topics, two important messages, if you want, that I want to share. The first one is this one. If you are serious about ALM, have a good branching strategy and a robust set of pipelines. So branching strategy and pipelines are important for sort of your ALM development sort of moving forward. When sort of we go to being an MVP, when I go to the summit and I talk to all the sort of the different program managers, a lot of the focus is on ALM, ALM ready, ALM friendly. So those are important terms to understand. How can you actually sort of understand what is the life cycle of your projects? What are the different environments that you're trying to target? And how can you move things from one environment to the other? So typically, we would recommend using automation, and I'll talk a little about sort of the capabilities using automation in that space. But also, as you become sort of more mature in that space, you've got a large team or multiple teams working on the same target production environment, then you need to think about your branching and how best to actually implement it. So again, as I said, it all depends. So let's talk about some of the factors that might influence the way you would design it. So starting from, first of all, the development style. So are you a one-man or one-woman band? So is it a small development, a small shop, one person, two people maybe working on it, and sort of looking at coordinating between each other? They might be co-located, for example. I know now in the COVID, or at least in New Zealand, everything is done remotely. So whether you're sort of down the street, whether sort of I'm talking to Lynn, who's literally 2 minutes sort of drive from where I am, or whether I'm actually talking to someone in Australia or in the US, it doesn't really matter, because sort of we're all separated and we have to use sort of video conferencing to communicate with each other. But if you have a small team and coordination is really easy, then things are significantly simpler. However, as you get sort of larger in terms of teams, so you've got a large team, maybe let's say 8 people or so, like let's say a squad, as we call it in agile terms, then things start getting more complicated because you've got several people sort of touching the code and doing things. However, if you're sort of geolocated and you've got different time zones and so on, then it becomes even more difficult, because communication becomes difficult, where development might happen during the day and then you hand over to another sort of offshore team. Development carries on during the night, and then things progress. And then you need a real robust sort of capabilities to manage any sort of conflicts that happen between the different development streams. So that's one thing, development style. The second one is solution complexity. So depending on how large your implementation is and how large your solutions are, you might have one solution, something really simple. You might have multiple solutions. You might have a lot of dependencies between the solutions, sort of multi-layering of those solutions. So consider how you want to do it. And, how much configuration versus how much customization you've got. Because, again, those are different beasts that you're dealing with. Customization, especially if we're talking about, let's say, C# code, or we're talking about JavaScript code, building plugins and so on, even Azure functions and so on. This is, in a way, simpler to manage than configuration. And the reason behind it is that because with this customization, we've got decades of experience in that space. You're talking about sort of merging that happened ages ago, even before the GitHub sort of ages, or the Git ages, where we used, VS Code, or not even VS Code, the predecessor to Visual Studio Code, or Visual Studio source control. So there's a lot of sort of capabilities that were available that help us understand how to do merging, what are the tools that we can do it, and what is supported in that space. With configuration, it's a little bit more difficult because you're talking about XML fragments, and not all merges in those XML fragments are actually supported. So be careful about that. And then the thing that I'm not going to discuss today, because there's no room for discussion around it, is make sure that whatever solutions you're deploying in upstream environments, we're talking about pre-prod, prod environments, make sure they are deployed as managed solutions. I would strongly recommend against unmanaged solutions, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of good practice and bad practice further down the track. And there's also ways in which you can actually develop those managed and unmanaged solutions, especially when you have layering and you've got solutions dependent on each other. So there's sort of some gotchas that I'll sort of describe in the sort of upcoming slides in there. Cool. So now that we understand sort of the solution complexity, the next question is, how many environments do we actually need part of the development that we're doing? So the Microsoft recommendation, again, is to have one environment per what will become a managed solution. So if you've got, let's say, 3 solutions, one that is managed, or actually all of them will be managed at the end, you need one environment for each one of them where this solution is unmanaged. And then everything else, if there are dependencies, they need to be deployed into those environments as managed. And then I'll show you an example in the next slide. But yeah, so the recommendation is to actually have one environment per unmanaged solution. The next question is, do we need a common environment per developer, or do we need one environment per developer? Again, if you read the documentation coming from Microsoft, they would recommend using one environment per developer, or even one environment per feature that you're building. And given the tools that we currently have, the moment you sort of get assigned a feature that you want to work on, you can spin up a new environment. You can say, hydrate my environment and install all the prerequisite solutions managed in there, and then the solution that I'm working on as unmanaged just at the very top of that layer. Build my feature, push it back into Git, and then tear down that environment. So you can have one environment per feature, and those are typically sort of short-lived. Typically, what I would use in sort of the, or at least in New Zealand, the way we do it is that we have more of long-running environments, and those will be one per solution. So whatever solution that we're building is going to be sort of on the unmanaged layer. Everything that it depends on will be managed under it, but then we would have those multiple dev environments sort of available in there, each one of them looking after a solution. At the end of the day, environments are free. As long as you have the capacity for it, you don't have to pay for it. So you might as well have as many as you want. But then if this is a restriction, then consider using Git as the source of truth. So your source repository, your source control as your source of truth. And then whenever you're working on something, spin up this environment, deploy the solution on it, work on it, and then pushing back into source control. So those are sort of the different ways of doing it. And also just be careful how you manage your development or downstream environment from your sort of production or pre-prod environment, sort of which are the upstream environment. So just make sure you've got the right number in there. And a typical example is we have a development team working on some capabilities, and then they push their sort of releases into the production environment, goes live, everybody's using it. Major defect is identified, severity 1, severity 2, defect is identified, needs to be addressed urgently. Now, the development environment has moved on since that release was put into the production environment. So how do we manage this situation? And in that example, then what you might do is use branching techniques within your source control, go and find out which branch has all the code, the latest code that is available in the production environment, spin up a new environment that sort of mimics production, push your sort of solutions in there in whatever format you need, and then go and fix the defect, push it back into Git, and then push it into production, and then retrospectively merge it back into the dev branch. And I've got all of that sort of in a diagram that I'll be sort of demonstrating later. So talking about solution layering, the next couple of slides will show you sort of best practice and maybe a bad practice if you want. But this is what I was talking about in terms of for each solution that you're building, make sure that you've got an environment for it, and anything that it depends on, is deployed there as managed. So this is good practice, and this is taken from the ALM documentation from Microsoft. So you've got environment one, you've got solution A. Solution A is being developed in there, and this is created as an unmanaged solution. Eventually, when you push it into the test environment, you package it as managed and push it into the test environment. So this is basically solution A that is deployed as managed and has field 1 and field 2 associated with it, and the form that has field 1 and field 2 associated with it. Now, if you're building solution B that is dependent on solution A, then as I said, create its own environment, make sure that solution B solution A, is deployed there as managed because it's a dependency and because eventually in production or in upstream environments, this is going to be a managed solution. And then whatever you're developing, deploy there as unmanaged. So solution B is the new solution that depends on solution A and it's created as unmanaged. And now when you export it as managed, and then now you have both of those as managed in the test environment A and B. Now, if you've removed field 2 from solution A, but you've done that in solution B, and then you've added field 3. So what you're going to end up at the end is field 1 and field 3, because the way the layering works is that it's going to do a diff between the different form XMLs, and we'll look at the differences between the two and then grab whatever has changed and then push the right information into the final solution, which is field 1 and field 3, which is exactly how you want to demonstrate it. Now, if you didn't follow that practice and solution A was actually unmanaged in the first 2 dev environments, then you're going to end up with this. And this is sort of bad practice, or it has a couple of gotchas. So as you can see, rather than have the dependent solution deployed as managed into your second environment, you deployed it as unmanaged, and then you continue building unmanaged on top of that. So the moment you start actually doing changes, rather than take a diff of the form XML, it's going to take the full form XML. And what's going to happen is that even though you've made changes, you're going to end up with sort of all the fields in your target state. So be very careful about how the sort of managed solutions work, especially when there's layering, and understand how the layering works so that you don't have surprises further down the track. So talking about all those different changes and how does the XML work. As you get into conflict, so people are working on different streams and then they push their information into Git. There's a few things that are allowed in terms of XML manipulation, and there are other things that are not allowed. It's important to understand the differentiation between the two. The first one is what is supported in terms of XML solution merges or changes. Ribbon editing is supported. Sitemap editing is supported. Form XML editing is supported. So this is where you've got a UI form and you're changing things around. Saved queries, so the lists, the views, whatever queries you've got in there, you can go and manipulate those, and isv.config changes that you can. So a handful, you can literally count them on one hand. What is not supported is all of that, another 18 things that are not. So if you change the schema, the attributes related to an entity or a table, the columns in a table, then changing those, if there's a conflict in there, is not supported. So just be very careful about it. And it's not uncommon that 2 people will be working on the same table, let's say account or contact or something custom, for example, and they're all adding attributes and making changes into it. If a conflict is detected, it's not supported to do that merge within the XML fragment. Instead, what you should do is just make sure that you deploy the solutions in the right environments and then make sure that it's managed through the user interface of Dataverse rather than through the XML merges. And there's a bunch of things. I'm not going to cover all of them. There's quite a few bits in here, but that's enough to just let you know that, just be careful about when you're doing merges and when you get conflicts on what is supported and what is not supported in there. So the branching strategy that we like to follow is the Git flow branching strategy. So this is sort of an example taken from the Jira website that talks about that Git flow branching strategy, and it's not uncommon. So basically what you're going to have is a main trunk or main branch, if you want. You're going to have your development environment or development branch, and then you're going to have the feature branches. So as you're working on a feature, you just separate it into its own branch. Once it's ready, you push it back into the dev branch. And then once this can go into production, then you merge it back into the main branch, and then you deal with it that way. So just in other terms, and also sort of understanding where conflicts may occur, this is what your sort of branching strategy might look like. So you've got the master, which is basically your source of truth of whatever is in production. You've got dev, which is the source of truth of whatever is being developed. So what we call vNext, the next version, the next iteration of the solution that you're trying to deploy. And then you've got a few feature branches. So branch A, which might be, a feature A, and then branch B, which is another feature that people are working on. So what I'm going to work through is the scenarios where all those red stars, the conflicts, might occur. And that will make you think on sort of what are the things that I may do to avoid those changes. And the recommendation is that whenever you're working on a feature branch, just make sure it's short-lived. The longer it lives, the more likely you're going to have conflicts, the more difficult it's going to be managed. So my recommendation is just make sure, like hours, we're talking about hours, maybe even minutes, create your feature branch, develop your sort of configuration, customization, and then merge it back into the dev environment so you don't have those issues moving forward. So let's walk through a few scenarios. The first one is that we deployed into the production environment. We did a hot fix. So this is this path in here. We did a hot fix because there was a severity 1, and then we sort of merged that back into the production environment. During that time, the development branch has moved on, so things have been developed. So when I do sort of a reverse integration back from the master branch into the development branch, conflict occurs. So this is one way where you might have to deal with it. Another example is, we didn't have any conflict, so we didn't sort of push back into the dev environment, but we did do a hot fix, and that went into the dev branch. Eventually, when the feature branch A goes back into the development branch, then this is where the conflict would occur. And again, as I said, like the shorter the sort of branch is in terms of timing, sort of the less likely we're going to have those issues. And even if we didn't have any issues in production, and we've got branch A that has been developed, but in parallel, branch B has been developed, and eventually both of those actually go into the dev environment, branch B, given that it's the one that gets in last, will likely have a conflict in there and will be managed. And the final one is basically, as we're doing the release, we notice that there's a bit of an issue, but again, development has moved on, and then we've got another conflict that occurred in there, and so on. And then sort of the branches live on and on for a very long time. So one technique to actually sort of minimize those branching, and that's definitely best practice, is to leverage what we call sort of the solution packager. The solution packager will allow us to create smaller fragments of XML rather than larger ones that will help us minimize all the conflicts that might occur. So let me actually just start. So I'll stop the slides for now. And what I've got in here, this is my desktop. Hopefully you guys can see it. And I've got a sort of simple solution that I've exported from sort of my Dataverse environment, and I've unzipped it. So if I sort of double click on it, you will notice this is the typical structure of a solution. So you would have some XML fragments in it. You might have some sort of workflows defined in there. But the main one is the customization.xml. And that's usually a relatively large sort of XML fragment. So let's see, if I open it with Notepad, so it's quite large. 0.5 megabyte of XML data is a fair amount, and it's huge. If anything happens, if there's a conflict in that XML fragment, then definitely it's going to be a nightmare to identify it. Not to mention that as you're actually sort of evolving the solution, there are little bits that change, even though you haven't changed anything in your solution. Even if you just did a couple of exports, then there are a few sort of references that will change around and will always be identified as conflicts. So the way to actually fragment that and have visibility over what is changing and where the conflict lies, you would use the solution packager. So what I've got in here, within that same folder, that tools folder, I've got the core tools. And I've got some of the capabilities that we use. So as CRM SVC util is what generates sort of the early binding classes from Dataverse. And we've got solution packager and some telemetry capabilities. So let's have a look at solution packager. And more specifically, so I'm just going to sort of do the EXE, and I'll show you what are the capabilities that are available in there. So in here, it just comes up sort of with the CLI options that you've got, and you can either package or extract. And the example that I'm going to run right now is the extract. So I'm going to take the content that is available within a specific zip file, which is the solution container, and then sort of break that down into smaller chunks. And then the second part is once I've got all those chunks, then I can pack them back. And then when I do that, I can define am I going to package it as unmanaged? Am I going to package it as managed? Or am I going to create two different zip files, one that is managed, one that is unmanaged? So that gives you control using the CLI on what you can do with those solutions. So let me run that command again. So this is the full command. So let me start zoom it. Cool. So the action that I'm doing is to extract the zip file. So this is the zip file that is located in there. And I'm going to put it into a folder called eval extract, which is the name of my solution. And hit enter in here. And as you can see, it actually broke down that massive XML file into smaller chunks. So let's have a look at what it looks like. So this is the eval extract folder that I talked about. Double click on that. And as you can see, the structure looks different. We don't have just a massive customization.xml, but I've got a collection of entities. Each entity is going to have its own folder. Each folder is going to have the form XML, the saved queries, the XML, the entity.xml. So this is basically your schema, and the ribbon requirements for it. And that covers all the different entities that I've got. There's also a separation of sort of the option sets, the global option sets, the workflows, and some other capabilities. And you will notice that, let's open one of the entities and let's have a look at, the larger one might be this one maybe. And let's have a look at that entity.xml, 57K compared to 0.5 MB. Significant difference in sort of the size of the solution that you're building. So again, that will break down your massive XML fragment into smaller fragments, and it will allow you to understand as conflicts occur, where have they occurred, and so that you can manage them individually and in a more efficient way. Cool. Now that we've seen that, let's talk a little bit about sort of some of the pipeline capabilities that will be considered as best practice and how we can use the solution packager as well as other capabilities within sort of the Azure DevOps pipelines. So this is sort of the typical scenario that I would go through when I'm doing a deployment. So I would start with having an environment, a dev environment. As we said, it could be one per environment, one per solution, one per feature, whatever it is. You build your solution, you run your unit test in there, you make sure everything is good. And back in the old days, once it's done, you would push it manually into the next environment. That environment would be ready and waiting for it. However, now we can do things in a slightly different way. We can push our solution, so extract it from our Dataverse into Git. And in there, we can run some validation. And I'll show you things like solution checker. You can run maybe some unit test, make sure everything is okay, and so on. Especially if you have sort of lower code, sort of C# that can be unit tested, or JavaScript even, then you would run your validation in there. Now, as I said, we can use the solution packager to sort of unpack and package, and then you can generate your artifacts using sort of that capability. And then once you're ready, you can spin up a new environment on demand using pipeline automation, and then deploy those changes automatically, again, using that pipeline. And then once you're done, then you can use your regression test in this environment, be it something like Easy Repro or integrated testing, or even, if you're using the Canvas apps, you have the Test Studio that is available in there that also allows you to do sort of UI testing. You can do your validation in there. And all of that can be automated. Now, the full end-to-end cycle, we typically do overnight. So we do our nightly builds where all the code is packaged. Everything is sort of pushed into a vanilla environment created from scratch. Our entire suite of tests are run, be it sort of integration test, unit test, UI test, security test, penetration test, and so on. And then we get a report in the morning on whether we've got any issues or not. And that gives us assurance that our development is healthy and so on. Now, luckily, there are tons of tools that are available out there that will help us achieve this goal. Some of them are official, provided by Microsoft. Some of them are created by the community. But the main two in Azure DevOps, if you go to the marketplace, are the Power Platform build tools, which is the official one provided by Microsoft. So as you can see, it has a little official tick next to Microsoft.com. And then there's another one called the Power DevOps tools, provided by an MVP from the UK called Wael Hamze. And he has been sort of working on that. His actually tools were available before the official Microsoft ones were there. And with my clients, I usually use both. It's not one or the other. I use a little bit of both. I like the official ones because those are the ones sort of provided by Microsoft, and they're sort of constantly maintained. There's a whole team behind them. However, Wael's one have things that Microsoft would typically not put in their packages. For example, he has capabilities where you can go and cherry pick what you want from an unmanaged solutions and push them into another unmanaged solution, which can come in really handy in the downstream environments. Obviously not something that you would do in production, but then, for the mechanism and how things work, his has a few things that are actually quite nifty and quite handy. So do explore both of them and see what works best for you. And if whatever you want to do is not available part of those tools, that's perfectly fine, because at the end of the day, they are built on top of the CLI, or they are built on top of libraries. So one thing that you can do is look at using the command line sort of capability, or using the PowerShell capability, because then it's limitless. What you can do is really sort of the sky is the limit. A typical example of things that might be a little bit tricky, where you might need a little bit of scripting or maybe a little bit of logic, like running a little bit of C# code to do it, is when you're deploying a solution from one environment to the other that has a connection to Azure Service Bus, for example. So your solution will be aware of it. Your solution will know that there's a connection in there, but then your solution will be pointing to the dev environment because this is where you're exporting it from. As you move it from one environment to the other, you have to make sure that this endpoint is now pointing to the right environment in Azure as you're moving on. And the way we do that is typically with a little script that would go and point it to the right environment. So those are things to consider as you're actually building those capabilities. Now let's focus on the first one on the left, which is the Power Platform build tools. And let's see what are the sort of activities that you can run part of it. And it's actually quite rich. You can back up environments, you can copy environments, you can create environments, delete environments, restore them, reset them. You've got full control over your sort of environment management. But then what's on top of that is that you can also do a lot of solution manipulation and sort of management. And you can also use the solution packager to extract and package your solution, which would come in really handy. Now, specifically around environments, do consider running some sort of a workflow as sort of different people are working on different environments. And this is something coming from sort of the Microsoft documentation. As this is a sample workflow, you don't have to use it exactly as it is, but it's something to consider. So you've got someone requesting access to an environment, and it is being sent, and then they check whether it's legit, whether there's a business case for it, and then if it's okay, then they will. If it's not, then they'll reject it. But then otherwise, there's some daily checks that see how long have you had this environment? Does it exceed the expected lifetime of that environment? And then sort of if it does, then consider deleting this environment. Otherwise, sort of email the developer and let them know what's happening. So there's a little bit of management in here that sort of is a good practice usually, just so that you don't have proliferated environments that live on forever. So as I mentioned, I work for DXC. DXC is a global company across the world that has many Dynamics developers or Power Platform developers. And I've got my environment in there that I'm going to be demoing in a second. But then when I see the list of environments that are available in there is hundreds, because everybody wants to create their own environment, and it's best to have this sort of workflow to just tidy up anything that is not required. Even though they are free, they are using storage, and storage comes at a premium cost. So do consider that and how you want to manage them. So some of the other things that I mentioned that you might want to add into your pipeline is static analysis. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at that. So typically you would run that through the user interface and say, run the solution checker, check if there's anything wrong with it, and then come back with some results and then deal with it. But there are ways of introducing that into your pipeline, and then the pipeline would behave differently based on the results coming out of your sort of solution checker. So let's do a quick pipeline demo before we carry on into the governance side of things. Just conscious of time, we have about 15 minutes to go, so hopefully I'll be able to finish in the next 10 minutes, hopefully. All right, so what I've got in here is my Azure DevOps environment. This is the DXC instance that they've sort of kindly provided to me, and I'm going to go through pipelines in there. There's a few that I've created. So for previous demos, I did Dynamics on a few weeks ago, so that was a bit of fun in here. But let's create a new pipeline. Now, recently, Microsoft has been talking a lot about creating your pipelines in YAML, and this is best practice. And once you get used to YAML, love it or hate it, YAML is there to stay, but it is very powerful, mainly because you can host your pipeline as code in your repository. So basically you can, every time you want to run a pipeline, you can get it from Git. It's sort of like one thing inside the other, sort of an inception model. And given that it's YAML, then as you make changes, you can do diffs and then have a look at what changed in the past, and sort of what is still available in there. And then you've got lots of tools that would help you sort of build those YAML pipelines. Visual Studio Code is getting really good at it, and there's also sort of a work in there on having a user interface for YAML, which comes in quite handy. But for the purpose of this example, I'm just going to use the classic editor just so that I can visualize what are the things that are happening in there. And we're going to start with a Git repository with an empty job. So pipeline is ready. I just want to sort of define what are the sort of the jobs that the agent needs to create. And as I said, you can go on Power Platform, and in here I've pre-installed it from the marketplace. So I've got all the different actions that I can create. Notice how we've got a pack solution. So you can sort of extract, or starting with the export solution from your environment, and then running an unpack solution so that it actually can push it back into Git as sort of all the smaller fragments, as opposed to a big massive XML fragment. And then once you're ready with it, then you can package it. And then again, like if I add this in here, you will notice that within the packaging, I can say I want it managed or unmanaged, I want it both, and then I can define exactly where I want it. So you've got full control over it in here. So let's have a look at some of the other capabilities that we can have. And the one that I am actually interested in is the solution checker. And that's for a good reason. So we've talked about the environments and setting up and all of that. So let's see, where is the tool? Import, solution upgrade, export checker. Here we go. That's the one that I was after. And I would click on that. Now, this is, as you're connecting to your environment, I strongly recommend using service connections. And in fact, that's the only way to do it with the sort of Power Platform build tools that are provided with Microsoft. If you're doing it with PowerShell, then you can get away with something slightly different. Maybe something more like a username and password, but service connections, definitely the way to go. Go and define them, and have a sort of an application user or a service principal that will allow you to sort of connect to your environment, application ID, and then a secret, and then host those in either secure Azure DevOps, or potentially you can even store them in Key Vault and then retrieve this information from there. So all of those are options that you can use. The one thing I really want to sort of focus on is, as you're running the solution checker, you can have different rule sets. So there's a couple in here. And the reason why I'm pointing that, I think this is a step towards a more mature set of tools. So you can run the default solution checker, which is basically what you get out of the box. in your user interface, or you can actually run the app source certification checker. This one is a little bit sort of stricter in terms of what is allowed and what is not. And this is the one that actually Microsoft uses behind the scenes to check your solution before it goes to app source. And sort of the philosophy at Microsoft is that, and I've heard it many times by Charles Lamana, by some of the lead architects like Matt Barber, he's principal architect of sort of the Power Platform in Dynamics 365. And their philosophy is that if we have those tools to visualize and sort of run checks on your code or your environment, then those tools should be available to you guys. And this is how they're actually providing us those tools so that we have no surprises as we're pushing our solutions into app source. The other thing to note is that this is a very good indication where you can have custom rules in there. And I think this is very exciting. And the way I envisage it, although I haven't heard that in any of the channels, but wouldn't it be great if you can define your own rules and then define them in here so that you run the checks that you think are appropriate as opposed to something that is pre-baked? Think of it as, ReSharper for C# or any static analysis capability like, SonarQube or Parasoft that would run sort of security checks where you define what you wanted to check, what you want to sort of check and understand. There might be a predefined library, but you pick and choose what you want out of it and create your own checker. So this is really promising in terms of capabilities. And anyway, going through the Power Platform, as we can see, there's tons of information or sort of helpers on how you can create your environment, delete them, restore them, back them up, and so on. You've got sort of full support for exporting, importing solutions, managed, unmanaged, and also creating the sort of solution checker. So really, really strong set of capabilities that are available in there. Cool. Now that we're done, let's move into the next part of the presentation with 5-ish minutes left, so I'll skim through it really quickly. And maybe that's a good thing because, as I said, in terms of COE Starter Kit, we've seen a lot of support from sort of other presentations in other streams at the Dataverse Summit. So a good example is Manuela's session. So just go and have a look at it if you want to know a little bit more about the Starter Kit. But this is where my second message comes in. And I've heard that many times before. So to avoid the Lotus Notes cloud reincarnation, implement Power Platform governance. And I can't stress how important that is. And the reason I'm saying that is because a lot of our customers have Lotus Notes. In Wellington, we've got a lot of financial institutions as well, a lot of government, as I mentioned, and they use Lotus Notes, or they used to use Lotus Notes a lot. There was no governance whatsoever using Lotus Notes. And as such, there was a proliferation of applications everywhere, little databases here and there, and then things that became popular, and all of a sudden people started sharing them, and all of a sudden they became enterprise assets, yet they were built by one person who's average in Lotus Notes. So governance and sort of understanding how things work is really, really important. So let's go through sort of what's included in the Center of Excellence. There's a lot of sort of overview, sort of understanding how to set up, how to get ready, what are the things to consider, and so on. But also, once this is done, then you've got the admin tools that will help you sort of set things up and sort of go into the governance stage, so audit, monitor, visualize what's happening. And finally, as you see things sort of taking shape and people being interested, then you would nurture your internal community and you would get them to sort of understand what is best practice, how we do things, and how do we run things. So what's in the box of the Center of Excellence? Well, there are core components, sort of governance components, nurturing components, and then there are some standalone capabilities. The one that I want to focus on is the ALM one, which I'll come in to shortly. So some of the monitoring things that you would ask yourself is who's using this Power Platform, who's creating apps, who's sharing them, how many people are actually sort of using those ones that are being shared, and what can you do with it? And this is a real story from a customer that I worked on with recently, and their sort of IT department that looks after the Power Platform environment in Dataverse came to me and said, hey, can you help us sort of set up our COE so that you can monitor what's happening in there? And I said, sure, well, I can do that. Yeah, why not? And then I installed it and then we started monitoring. And what we realized is that someone else has installed the COE somewhere else and then is using it unknown to the IT department or unknown to the Power Platform sort of administrators. So the COE, to discover another COE, is actually a very powerful story to see how things can go out of control and how important it is to have that governance and be able to monitor what's happening. So there are a few dashboards that are examples on how you can see what's happening, Power BI dashboards, who's doing what, and who are your most common users, how many apps do they have, and so on. So there's lots and lots of information. As you can see at the top, covers environments, apps, flows, professionals, connections, and so on. And that will help you visualize what's happening in your organization and introduce DLP and sort of other policies and nurture it. So basically contact those people that are quite active and turn them into champions. So how do you engage? You've noticed someone is using an application and they're going sort of a little bit overboard. What do? Well, you can delete their stuff, or you can actually nurture them. So you can go and contact them and say, hey, it looks like you're active. Here's some sort of, do's and don'ts, gotchas that sort of we follow. This is our governance process. If it becomes important, then, you need to go through approvals and things like that. So you nurture that, and then you build those champions within your organization. And then what's really important is, as you see something becoming important and gaining in popularity, it's really important to put it into a governance process. So, making sure they follow best practice, making sure if it becomes an enterprise asset, that the organization knows about it, and then they've got sort of bits to sort of look after it and so on. So as sort of we progress, I'm probably going to start skimming through those bits in here. So I've got examples of, how to do your governance, how to nurture, so do training in a day, develop your standards, share those standards, make sure there's an onboarding process, and sort of have an innovation backlog. So if people want sort of new features introduced and so on, put them into a backlog and manage them that way. But most important thing is make sure that there's visibility for the application architects in your organization so that they know that this is turning into an enterprise asset. And then the one that I want to talk about is the ALM Accelerator for Advanced Makers, AA for AM. If you haven't heard of it, I strongly recommend you go and have a look at it. It's actually a really, really, really cool tool. And basically what it is a Canvas app that helps you understand sort of your environments, your solutions, and help you manage the work that you're doing and then pushing it back into DevOps. So it has a bunch of steps defined in here from 1 to 11. So get your solutions from your source of truth, which is your source control, extract it, put it into your environment, let's say in an unmanaged fashion, because you're going to work on it, and then sort of push those features into a specific branch. So it manages both your sort of solution, your repository, so your Git environment, and also your destination, so it can push to other destinations. And it's a starter kit, so it comes with sort of all the pipelines and the capabilities, the Canvas app, the visualization that will help you do this end-to-end automation. And it's not necessarily targeted for sort of advanced developers, but it can be targeted for sort of beginners or sort of citizen developers. And this is sort of what it looks like. So you can click on import solution into a specific environment, and it will get it. It will create a branch for it. It will sort of create the pull request for it. And then once you're happy with it, then you can delete it and you can sort of refresh your environment. It gives you a Canvas app to manage all of that in a visual fashion, so you don't even have to go into Azure DevOps if you don't have to. And then you can have multiple of those sort of running at the same time. There's a couple of videos, a short one and a long one, that describe sort of the things that you can do with it. But most importantly, there's a few resources in there, just if you want to go read about it or read about sort of some of the other capabilities that I talked about today. So with 4 minutes to go, thank you very much for having me at the Dataverse Summit. I'm more than happy to answer any questions we've got.
Yeah, we have got quite a few, so we'll try to cover as much as we can, and then rest of them you can answer it in the chat. So first question is from Philip. Is setting up new connection environments created on the fly is still problematic. Resetting existing environments seems to be the workaround. So do you have any?
Yeah, so this is something that Microsoft is aware of, and quite often, so whenever we're creating new connections, new environments, especially in Azure DevOps, sort of security departments will come to us and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Not everybody can do that. So the only way to do it at the moment, you're right, is to actually pre-bake those environments and then reset them rather than delete them and recreate them. But your mileage might vary. So if you've got a more lenient sort of setup, then it is a bit of a manual step at the moment. But there are a few things that you can do there just to help you out. But you are correct. So typically what we would do is reset an environment and recreate it, because then there is less overhead if you want.
Right. Second question is again from Philip. How long does it take typically for your team to spin up a development environment? We have dependent solutions that might take 40 minutes to install before we can start working on unmanaged solution under development.
Yeah, and this is why sort of, as I mentioned, typically what we would do in sort of our development type of work, rather than do it per feature or per developer, we have those long-running environments. Again, your mileage might vary. So some solutions may take minutes to deploy. Some solutions may take 10 minutes or 15 minutes or even more to deploy. So it depends on the complexity of it. My recommendation in that space is fragment your solutions into smaller components, so you don't have a behemoth that you're deploying that will take ages and likely fail. So keep them simple, keep them small, understand your dependencies. Typically what we would do is define those in a JSON format or in an XML format that would say, if I'm working on this unmanaged solution, those are the managed solutions that I need to deploy associated with it. And then you do those micro installations, and then your environment is ready, as opposed to a behemoth and then one unmanaged solution. So yeah, just fragment it so that you've got a little bit more control over it. That's the best way if you want to do sort of on-demand environment creation.
Yeah, and actually that speeds up the process, because sometimes you might have fragment of solutions which are not dependent on each other. So you can deploy them parallelly as well. So speed up the process too.
Absolutely.
Next question is from Michael, and his question is, does a PCF control require a separate solution and environment similar to the diagram that you were showing before?
Not necessarily. No. So you can package your PCF control within another bundle if it makes sense. PCF controls, the way they're typically built is that they are reusable components. So I would put them in a core solution or in an extension solution by itself. You might have several, like, call it a UI extension solution, and then bundle them together. But yeah, it's not necessarily. It depends on how you're setting up your environment. If it's only for that solution, then yeah, by all means. But otherwise, it's up to you.
Yeah, the only caveat over there I would add is the prefix of the PCF control itself should match the prefix of the solution. Otherwise, when you're importing it into the next environment, you would get errors.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Next question is again from Philip, is like, he's just wondering what is the reasoning of not adopting trunk-based development or a release flow?
Trunk-based development on a release flow. I don't really think I understand the question, but typically having those feature branches allows you a little bit more flexibility of the work that people are doing before merging back. And the main idea behind it is that you would have a pull request. The pull request will then go through a stage review. And you would ensure whether you are happy to actually put it into the sort of back into the trunk or not. Hopefully that answered your question. But yeah, typically I would just keep those feature branches separate so that we've got a little bit more flexibility of sort of work happening in there. Trunk-based may sort of minimize your sort of merging issues. But it's usually good practice just to create a feature branch and then move it back in. If it's short-lived, then hopefully you won't have any major merging issues.
And there are a few other questions, so I would let you attend them in the chat. But before we go off this, I think so we should answer this question as well, which is important. Is the pack solution that is available in the Power Platform DevOps tools, does it uses pack CLI commands or does it uses solution packager?
I'm not sure exactly what's happening under the hood, but sort of the results are basically the same. So you can use CLI if you want to in your pipeline. I use sort of this capability. I'm not sure if it's sort of wrapped within a library or a capability, but again, like the results are exactly the same. Whatever sort of works best for you.
Cool. Well, Rami, this was fantastic. I loved branching strategies that you showed. ALM has always been a topic where no one has attained like full confidence over ALM when it comes to Dataverse or Power Platform overall, right? It's all these new components that always causes like if you attain confidence, then the new components come into play like environment variables or connection references, and then they break things again. And then now you have to come up with a strategy to make all those things work. So it's always been a good talking point, ALM. So I always
Absolutely.
is intrigued about learning new ways of doing things in ALM. So
And
thank
we're
you for
still
this
learning.
session. Yes, we are all
No
still
worries.
learning. Yeah.
No worries.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we got something new out of that. But thanks, Danish, for the opportunity. And yeah, it was lovely presenting. I'll answer the questions now on chat.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so the next session is from Diego, and he's going to show us about PCF control, and he's going to do some hands-on with PCF control. It's a near dear topic to my heart, obviously, most of you know. So looking forward for Diego to see how what he's trying to show today. So Diego, all with you. Close is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me try to share my screen.
Think
do you guys hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Awesome.
Oh, Rami's screen is showing up. Okay, that's why I was confused. Okay, I can see your screen now.
Awesome. Let me try to share my other screen. Screen two.
Yeah, and Diego, before you start, just a second, hold on. I'm just gonna stop recording and